My wife said she needed some time, so I gave her a divorce. When I spoke those cold words, filled with all the pain I didn't even know I was capable of bearing, I saw the world collapse in her eyes. Frozen, as if she had just woken up from a good dream and realized that the nightmare was, in fact, reality, she babbled nonsense, desperately trying to piece together what she herself had destroyed. I stood still, silent, watching as she fell apart, and in that moment, I understood that certain betrayals are like shattered glass. No matter how hard we try to pick up the pieces, there will always be invisible shards that will continue to cut inside. It all started weeks before, with subtle signs that at the time, blinded by confidence, I attributed to routine, tiredness or the fantasies we created to avoid facing what we fear. An absent smile, hugs that seemed like obligations, looks that avoided mine. I tried to believe that they were phases, natural cycles of mature love, but an instinctive part of me screamed, writhed, like a caged animal about to be forgotten. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to believe it. But betrayal has a smell, it has a taste, it has a presence. It's a shadow that grows in the corners of the eyes, even when the light is on. I need some time, she said, and I, thinking it was our chance to fight for ourselves, asked, almost begging, if that was all she wanted. She nodded, so convincingly, so hypocritically, that for a moment I almost was fooled again. But that night, alone in the silence of our home, surrounded by memories of years of dedication, I began to see what had always been in front of me. The hidden phone, the deleted messages, the lame excuses, the increasingly frequent absences. Every detail, every forgotten fragment, now made sense like pieces of a cruel puzzle that revealed a picture I never wanted to put together. So I decided not to just give him a break. I decided to free her. Free myself from the illusion that she still belonged to me, that there was still respect between us. I scheduled the divorce without hesitation, without arguments, without tears. When she received the papers, the shock on her face confirmed what I already knew. She never thought that I would have the courage to react, that I wouldn't beg for her to stay, that I wouldn't grovel for a love that, for her, was already dead. The tears came too late. The pleas, the passionate speeches, the promises of change, it all sounded false, like a play staged to save what, for her, had never been more than convenience. But what she didn't know, what she could never predict, was that life takes a toll. And the price, for some, is much higher than a simple broken heart. In the days that followed, she tried desperately to keep up appearances, as if she still had control of the narrative. But one by one, its pillars began to crumble. Mutual friends became distant faces, awkward silences took over conversations, and even those she considered unconditionally by her side began to look at her with suspicion and contempt. The lover she thought was her new beginning turned out to be a ghost, someone who never promised to stay after the new thing wore off. Not only did he disappear, he made sure to wash his hands of any responsibility, leaving her alone to face the abyss she dug with her own hands. The humiliation was silent at first, but it soon became public. Family gatherings, friends' parties, social media, everywhere, the shine she once had quickly faded. His image, constructed with so much care over the years, was now seen in another light, that of someone who betrayed, deceived and lost everything for a cheap illusion. What hurt her most, however, was not the abandonment, nor the loneliness, nor even the shame. It was realizing that, unlike her, I didn't just survive, I flourished. As she sank into her own mire of regret, my life went on. Not because I had planned revenge, but because, in freeing myself from the lie, I found again the man I was before I was silently destroyed. The freedom to be honest with myself has brought me opportunities that I would never have had while carrying the weight of one-sided love. A new career, new friendships, new passions. And, inevitably, a new love, a love that was born from truth, from complicity, and not from obligation or guilt. I remember a specific day, months after everything. I was walking through the city's central square, holding the hand of someone who looked at me as if I were the entire universe, and as I turned the corner, I saw her. Sitting alone on a bench, with her eyes lost, holding a cell phone as if waiting for a call that will never come. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and in that look, there was everything: pain, regret, longing, despair. But there was no more love. Not from me. I didn't stop. I didn't hesitate. I moved forward, with my head held high, with a light heart. She was left behind, trapped in a past she could no longer touch. And it was there that I understood, definitively, that sometimes true revenge is simply being happy. But the story you think you know is just the surface. What happened the day I filed for divorce, the exact words that were said, the painful truths that were revealed, and the shock that made that moment unforgettable for everyone involved, all of this goes far beyond a simple separation. There is a truth, a cruel and silent detail, that turned that signature into a turning point in her life, and that forever sealed her fate in a way that she could not even imagine in her worst nightmares. And believe me, when you know what exactly happened after she begged on her knees to take it back, you will realize that this story is much more than betrayal. It's about justice. About reconstruction. And about how, sometimes, life knows exactly how to make those who make mistakes pay the price. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any type of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful truth: betrayal destroys lives, corrodes families, and leaves deep scars. Our goal is to show, through intense stories, the bitter price of disloyalty. Get ready now to dive into a shocking story that will stir your emotions and your perception of trust and love. Let's get started. David and Isabella seem to have been designed for each other. From the beginning, something about them matched almost instinctively, as if they were two fragments finally found amidst the chaos of life. David was a man with a firm presence and welcoming gaze, one of those who didn't need to raise their voice to be heard. He had worked for years as a manager at a technology company, always balancing his professional ambition with a silent dedication to his family. His green eyes, always attentive, revealed a soul he loved deeply without needing to announce it to the world. Isabella, on the other hand, was the tame hurricane. Owner of a serene beauty and an intelligence that brightened up any environment, she won over with her easy laugh and the manner of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Graduated in architecture, she divided her days between challenging projects and homely moments that always ended in laughter, hugs, and shared dreams. They built a solid life together, one of those that seemed unshakable from the outside. The wedding, celebrated with a simple party but full of meaning, symbolized more than a union. It was the beginning of a promise of eternity. David and Isabella cultivated that relationship with patience and care, respecting individualities, supporting achievements, sharing setbacks. They bought a house with a light facade and large windows, where each room told a story of the two of them. The kitchen full of notes stuck to the fridge, the living room with a worn-out sofa where so many nights were spent between movies, popcorn, and silly discussions about which was the best season finale of some series. Everything there exuded complicity. Over the years, they have shaped a comfortable routine. David liked the quiet mornings, the smell of coffee filling the house while he read the news, and Isabella took care of the plants on the porch. On Saturdays, it was almost a ritual to go out to the market together, even when we didn't need anything urgent. It was the pleasure of being there, of sharing even the simplest of gestures, that made everything make sense. At night, after long days of work, the meetings on the balcony, washed down with cheap wine and endless conversations, became small islands of happiness where they reconnected, where they remembered who they were before obligations and external pressures tried to swallow what they had built. Over time, the burning passion of the early years transformed into something more mature. A love with deep roots, silent and comfortable, that didn't need great public demonstrations to exist. The simple exchange of glances during a family dinner said more than any flashy statement on social media. David admired the way Isabella managed to be practical and dreamy at the same time, how her voice softened the most difficult days and her presence made even what seemed unbearable lighter. Isabella, in turn, saw in David a serene strength, someone she could trust without reservation, who knew how to listen without judgment and advise without arrogance. It wasn't a fairy tale life. There were fights, like in any real relationship, and there were times when they both felt tired, irritated, even disconnected. But always, the foundation seemed solid. The house, with its walls filled with pictures of travel and souvenirs, was living testimony that, despite the storms, they always found their way back to each other. And that was what David believed with all his being, that at the end of the day, after the fights and the harsh words, after the involuntary absences and the heavy days, they were, and always would be, each other's home. When Isabella started talking about needing space to rethink some things, David felt an uncomfortable cold settle in his stomach, but he quickly pushed it away. He preferred to believe that it was just a phase, the result of the stress of work, recent changes, perhaps even some internal crisis that would soon pass. He didn't allow himself to sink into suspicion, not because he was naive, but because his nature made him believe the best in people, especially the best in her. I understood that love sometimes required patience and trust. And David, as far as he knew, had plenty of both. At family gatherings, Isabella still smiled at him in that way that only they knew. On nights at home, she still hugged him, although a little more mechanically, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. David saw it, felt it, but ignored it. Not out of weakness, but because the love he had for her was so great that he preferred to bear the anguish of a gradual separation alone rather than run the risk of forcing a definitive separation. Whenever he watched her lost in her silent reveries, he tried to convince himself that it was temporary, that soon she would be the same again, that they would laugh together again, without that invisible weight hanging in the air. Close friends, little by little, began to comment that Isabella was more reserved, that she always seemed in a hurry to leave meetings, that she no longer spoke about her projects with the usual enthusiasm. David listened to the comments with a calm smile, avoiding letting the small spark of uneasiness that was lighting up in his chest show. At home, he continued to be the attentive husband, the companion who prepared dinner on difficult days, who sent messages in the middle of the work-day just to say he was thinking about her. Isabella, in turn, reciprocated with minimal, subtle gestures, but enough to keep alive the hope that everything was still under control. On days when sadness seemed more difficult to contain, David took refuge in memories. I mentally went back to the first trip they took together, to the moments when they danced awkwardly in the living room without music, to the early mornings when they dozed cuddled on the sofa. Each memory was a silent reminder that they had built something too great to be shaken by mere passing turmoil. That's what he believed. That was what he was betting all his heart on. The request for a while came on an ordinary afternoon, without warning, without extraordinary signs. They were sitting at the table, drinking coffee, talking about banalities, when Isabella put down the cup and, with a choked voice, said that she needed to breathe, she needed to understand herself, she needed space. David, overcome by a feeling of unreality, just nodded, without asking questions, without protesting. The fear, the doubt, the pain, it all stuck in his throat, as if a part of him refused to process what was happening. In the days that followed, David tried to act natural. He continued his routines, continued smiling, continued believing that, by respecting the space she asked for, he would also be building the bridge to bring her back. In his moments of solitude, when the house seemed too big and empty, he still clung to the hope that this was just a break, not an end. Never, not even in his darkest nightmares, did he consider that the space she asked for could be filled by someone other than him. Isabella, at that time, seemed even more absent. His visits became brief, his touches rare, his smiles rehearsed. But David persisted. I wanted to believe. I needed to believe. Because recognizing another possibility would be like admitting that the entire story they built together had been just a fragile chapter, ready to crumble in the face of the first serious storm. And he wasn't prepared to deal with the idea that the person he'd bet his entire life on might, deep down, already have chosen a path that didn't include him. Life, however, does not forgive prolonged innocence. Soon, the truths would begin to unravel before David like a thread that, once pulled, can no longer be stopped. Every gesture, every word, every look that he now ignored out of love, would reveal himself completely. And, when you finally faced reality, you would understand that not every time you ask for is a cry for help. Sometimes it's just the silent harbinger of a decision already made. What David still didn't know, what no gesture of hers completely revealed, was that, soon, his entire life would change abruptly. And not just because of the inevitable separation, but because of something much bigger, something that would leave permanent marks on everyone around, something that would destroy not just love, but pride, image, trust. A twist that would make Isabella, for a long time, wish she had made different choices, but now it was too late to change. Time seemed to flow strangely since the request for space. The days dragged on heavily and the nights became torturous, made up of empty hours and repetitive thoughts that hammered David's head like incessant drops corroding a rock. He tried to remain firm, respect Isabella's request, pretend that the hole that was opening between them was just a phase, a dry crossing before the reunion. But there was something in the air, something he couldn't name, an imperceptible change that made everything colder, drier, more distant. She came to the house sporadically, always in a hurry, citing commitments, tiredness, last-minute obligations. The hugs were polite, the kisses were formal. Each time she left, David stood motionless in the doorway, watching the car drive away until it disappeared over the horizon, feeling as if each start took away an invisible piece of him. At work, concentration waned. Meetings became a blur of distant voices, and routine tasks seemed to require superhuman effort. Close friends began to notice the despondency, but David, with a forced smile, always found excuses: too much work, health problems, worries about his family. No one knew about the request for space, no one knew about the growing feeling of emptiness that consumed every part of his life. When he got home, he found not a home, but a silent memorial to everything that was slipping through his fingers. Dinners at the table turned into improvised snacks in front of the television. Nights on the balcony gave way to lonely early mornings, staring at the ceiling, listening to your own heartbeat in a painful rhythm. The feeling of inadequacy grew. Each message from Isabella was analyzed in detail, looking for hidden clues, loopholes that would indicate what was really going on. The answers were short, the calls were brief, the meetings were formal. Even so, David insisted on believing that she needed time to find her way back, that all of this was just a cruel test from which they would emerge stronger. It was this belief that kept him going, that made him continue tidying the house, preparing dinners that often ended up untouched in the fridge, keeping alive the illusion that, at any moment, she would knock on the door with her usual smile and say that she missed him. Then came the night when everything began to fall apart irreversibly. Isabella said she couldn't spend the weekend with him, claiming there was an architecture retreat in another city, a golden opportunity to expand her contacts and develop new projects. David smiled and supported her, even though inside a small spark of distrust lit up. It was something so out of character, so abrupt, that it sounded strange. But he pushed the doubt away, like so many other times, choosing to trust, choosing to believe. He said goodbye to her with a long kiss and a tight hug, as if, unconsciously, he knew that that gesture would be the last one, still filled with sincere love. The hours passed slowly and, that night, the loneliness seemed more acute than ever. David tried to distract himself with movies, books, even household chores, but nothing could quiet the growing restlessness inside him. On impulse, he decided to go for a walk. The cool night air seemed to promise some relief, a break for his exhausted mind. He wandered the deserted streets for hours, trying to find peace amidst the chaos within. When he returned home, exhausted and sweaty, he found a small, silver earring on the living room floor, which he immediately recognized. It wasn't his. It wasn't Isabella's. It was different, modern, something I had never seen at home before. A chill ran down his spine. He tried to rationalize it, maybe it was hers and he never noticed. Maybe it was old, lost in some obscure corner. But the heart, that silent traitor, already knew it wasn't. That night passed in vain. And the next morning, a new, desperate strength rose within him. He picked up the phone and started searching social networks, groups of friends, events in the city. He wanted to find some clue, something that would calm his mind or confirm his worst fears. It didn't take long to find photos of an event in the city's cultural center, supposedly restricted to invited architects. And there was Isabella, laughing next to a man David had never seen before. A man who looked at her in a way that she hadn't allowed himself to look at for a long time. Her eyes, however, were what sank the dagger most deeply. There was a lightness there, a happiness, a freedom that David hadn't seen in a long time, and worse, that he knew wasn't directed at him. He spent the entire day fighting the urge to call, to confront her, to demand explanations. But something stronger held him back, the desperate desire to be sure, to not commit an injustice based only on assumptions. So he decided to wait. Waiting for the right moment, the inevitable slip that would bring to light the truth that was already bleeding in his gut. When Isabella returned home on Sunday night, she acted as if everything was normal. He said that the retreat had been tiring but productive, and that he needed a shower before going to sleep. David just nodded, watching every gesture, every word, every breath, like an investigator analyzing a crime scene already knowing that the criminal is among them. During the week, absences became more frequent. Cancelled dinners, unanswered messages, ignored phone calls. David no longer had any doubts, he just waited for the final blow, the moment when the facade would completely crumble. And he came brutally, without ceremony. One Friday afternoon, he decided to leave work early, an almost instinctive need to return home, to confirm what he already knew deep in his soul. He parked the car on the back street, walked silently to the door, and as he entered, he heard muffled voices coming from the living room. He recognized hers immediately, but the other, male, was new. He approached in silence, his heart racing, his stomach churning, and what he saw on the other side of the room froze his blood. Isabella, his wife, his love, his life partner, was in the arms of another man. The smile she had denied him for weeks was now delivered without reservation. The touch that had become mechanical between them was, there, spontaneous, vibrant, alive. David lay there for seconds that felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to breathe. Every fiber of his being wanted to scream, to break everything, to demand answers, but he knew it would be no use. The betrayal was there, naked and raw, and there were no words that could erase that image forever etched in his memory. Without making a sound, David walked away, left the house, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something die inside him. The doubt, the hope, the love, it all dissolved into a heavy silence that seemed to suffocate the very air. He sat in the car, stared at the steering wheel for endless minutes, trying to understand when, exactly, he had lost Isabella. And, even more so, at what moment he had lost himself. He knew that discovery was just the beginning. That what came next would be even more devastating. Because what was behind that betrayal, what Isabella was still hiding, was something that would not only tear apart what was left of David's love, but also dismantle, piece by piece, the image he had of her, and the very life they built together. David remained motionless for a long time after seeing that. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the brutal realization that everything he had nurtured and defended for so long was now shattered before his eyes. Love, trust, plans, everything reduced to meaningless fragments. He drove aimlessly through the dark streets, his mind in turmoil, trying to understand how to move forward from that point. A cold fury grew in his chest, not the uncontrolled explosion that many would expect, but a silent determination not to allow this suffering to go unnoticed. The next morning, while Isabella still believed her little world of lies was intact, David took the first step toward turning the tide. On that rainy Sunday afternoon, she appeared, smiling nervously, carrying with her a box of cupcakes as if the artificial sweetness could cover up the real bitterness that had settled between them. David opened the door and let her in without saying a word, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her hesitate for a second. They sat at the table, and the silence was almost tangible, like a third element present, tightening the air between them. Isabella tried to fill the void with shallow conversations about work, new projects, future dreams, while David just watched, measuring every word, every forced smile, every nervous gesture. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and, in a voice so low it sounded like it was coming from an abyss, said he knew. There was no need to elaborate. The immediate change in her face, the involuntary contraction of her facial muscles, the desperation that surfaced in her brown eyes, said everything that needed to be said. Isabella stammered, tried to deny it, tried to minimize it, but David's silent firmness forced her to face reality. She began to cry, thick tears flowing uncontrollably, stammering disjointed excuses, trying to cling to empty justifications. She said she was confused, that she didn't plan it, that it was something that happened unintentionally. David just listened to her, without moving a muscle, without interrupting, like someone watching the inevitable collapse of a condemned building. When the crying became an uncontrollable sob, David stood up calmly and placed an envelope on the table. Inside were copies of conversations, photos, irrefutable proof that this was not a simple occasional betrayal, but something planned, cultivated in secret for weeks, perhaps months. Isabella looked at the envelope as if it were a weapon, a death sentence, and understood, at that moment, that there was nothing left that could be saved. He then spoke, each word coming out of his mouth with surgical precision, cutting deeper than any scream could. He said he was asking for a divorce. He said it was no longer his duty to try to save her from herself. And, even more, she said that, from that moment on, she would face the consequences of what she had caused alone. Isabella tried to get up, tried to follow him as he walked away, but her legs didn't seem to obey. He stood there, standing in the middle of the room, shaking, watching the man who had been his anchor disappear down the hall. She knew that losing David was terrible. But I still didn't know that this was just the beginning of the real hell. In the days that followed, Isabella's life began to fall apart in ways she could never have predicted. Mutual friends, those she trusted to support her, began to drift away. Invitations to events were quietly cancelled, calls left unanswered. Little by little, she realized that her story, her mistake, had spread like wildfire, burning the bridges she thought were unbreakable. People whispered behind the scenes, gave judgmental looks, avoided his touch, his presence. She who was once seen as an admirable, strong and charismatic woman was now the target of pity and contempt. At work, the situation was also deteriorating rapidly. Colleagues who once admired her now treated her with professional coldness. Projects began to be transferred to others, meetings were held without his presence. Even her boss, once her biggest supporter, started avoiding her in the hallways. Isabella felt isolation growing around her, an invisible barrier separating her from the world that was once hers. One mistake, one thoughtless choice, and everything she had built with so much effort was slipping through the cracks in her hands. At home, the loneliness was even more brutal. The emptiness of David's absence was like an incessant echo, reminding her every moment of what she had lost. He tried to get closer to old friends, he tried to justify his actions, to minimize what had happened, but it was too late. A stain had been carved into his reputation, a wound that not even time would be able to heal. Text messages went unanswered. Social media, once full of warm interactions, was now a wasteland of silence and exclusion. And then came the final blow, the one that would definitively seal his fate. On a gray afternoon, when visiting her parents' house, she was received with cold looks and bitter words. They already knew. Not through rumors, not through gossip, but through her own actions, which reached them through family acquaintances. Her father, a man of strict principles, looked her in the eyes with devastating sadness and told her that he had raised a daughter to honor her commitments, not to destroy them. Her mother, in tears, could barely look at her. Isabella, stunned, tried to explain, tried to seek compassion, but found only a closed door and a silence that hurt more than any scream of disapproval. That night, lying in her empty bed, staring at the dark ceiling, Isabella finally understood the extent of her ruin. It wasn't just the loss of the marriage, it wasn't just the loss of David. It was the loss of his identity, his position, his respect. Everything she once was now just a shameful memory in the eyes of those who knew her. The price of his choice was not just loneliness. It was a complete exile from the life she built, a condemnation to social oblivion, to the cruel indifference of those who once celebrated her. Meanwhile, David quietly rebuilt his life. Not in a hurry, not in anger, but with a renewed serenity, like someone reborn after the fire. Without needing to utter a word against Isabella, without needing to directly destroy what she was, he just let the world see what it needed to see. The truth, naked and raw, took care of the rest. And so he moved on, while she, standing in the same place, faced the unbearable weight of her own choices. But even in the depths of the abyss where Isabella now stood, there was still one last piece, one final revelation that she was unaware of. Something that, when it came to light, would not only confirm the devastation she already felt, but would make her understand that some losses are irreversible because they actually come as pure and relentless justice. Autumn was already taking over the streets, dyeing the sidewalks in tones of copper and rust, as if nature itself was responsible for symbolizing the inevitable end of the cycle that David and Isabella had lived through. The cold winds that blew through the trees seemed to echo the emptiness that now filled the spaces that were once occupied by the comfortable presence of a safe love. David moved on, his days filled with silent reconstruction, immersed in new projects, surrounded by new people, while Isabella slowly withered away amid the ruins she herself helped to build. Life, relentless and indifferent, had moved its pieces in a cruel and definitive way. With nowhere to run, Isabella tried to seek relief from the only person who was still familiar to her, David. After weeks of isolation and closed doors, she finally found the courage to look for him. She wasn't sure what to say, what to expect, but the need to see him, to try some kind of redemption, was stronger than the shame that was gnawing at her. He chose a discreet cafe, away from familiar eyes, sent a brief, almost desperate message, and waited, watching the fine rain that streaked the windows of the establishment like small, silent tears. David arrived with a calm face, an erect posture, wearing a dark jacket that gave him an even more distant air. His eyes no longer carried the raw pain of discovery, nor the latent fury of betrayal. There was only a cold detachment there, a firmness that Isabella recognized immediately as something that could no longer be reversed. He sat down in front of her without rushing, crossed his arms and waited for her to start speaking. Isabella, with a trembling voice, tried to explain the inexplicable. He spoke of confusion, of loneliness, of old and unresolved desires. She begged him to listen to her, to understand that, despite everything, there was still love. David remained silent, just looking at her with a firm gaze, like someone listening to a story who already knows the ending and knows that nothing that is said can change the truth of the facts. When she finally stopped talking, exhausted by her own tears, it was he who broke the silence with a voice so calm it sounded like a whisper. "You didn't just lose me," he said, "you lost yourself." The words hung in the air, sharp, irrevocable. Isabella tried to protest, but David continued, merciless in his serenity. He said that he had known everything long before he saw her with another man, that he had already noticed the distance, the poorly disguised lies, the lame excuses. He said that he chose to wait, to give her the chance to be honest, to fight for what they had, but that she chose the easiest, most cowardly path. "You destroyed the only true thing you had," he concluded, getting up and leaving a note on the table to pay for the coffee. He didn't look back as he left, leaving Isabella alone with her shame and regret. The rain picked up outside, and she sat there, feeling life slipping through her fingers once again. I didn't yet know that that would be just the first deep wound of that encounter. Days later, during an impromptu meeting with former co-workers, Isabella received the news that would crush her once and for all. The company where she worked, pressured by her deteriorating public image, decided to dismiss her under the justification of internal restructuring. Without position, without friends, without the support of her family, she found herself adrift, a castaway in a sea of regret and contempt. Desperation gripped Isabella in a way she had never experienced. He tried to seek support among old acquaintances, but discovered that, where before there were open doors, now there were only walls and insurmountable distances. Unreturned phone calls, ignored messages, declined invitations. It was as if she had become invisible, or worse, unwelcome. His only constant companion was silence and the bitter taste of his own wrong choices. One afternoon, driven by a last impulse to reconnect, Isabella went to her parents' house, only to find an even more brutal change. Her things were packed in boxes in the garage. Her father, his eyes hardened, explained that it was better for everyone if she made her way alone. That there was no room at home for betrayal, for dishonor. His mother, huddled in a corner of the room, cried softly, unable to intervene. Isabella didn't have the courage to object. I knew I had crossed lines that could never be erased. He took his boxes without saying a word, and left behind not just a house, but an entire history of belonging that was now denied him. With few resources and nowhere to go, Isabella rented a small room on the outskirts of the city, a cold and impersonal place that perfectly reflected what she felt inside. The gray walls, the musty smell, the biting loneliness, everything seemed like a natural extension of his own crumbling. I spent my days trying to find some meaning, some spark of hope, but it was like trying to light a fire in the middle of a storm. Deep down, she knew that she was living the inevitable result of every wrong choice she had made, and that there was no one else to blame but herself. Meanwhile, David flourished. Not out of revenge, not out of spite, but because he had found the strength in himself to start over. His projects prospered, new friends entered his life, and, unexpectedly, a new love began to germinate, discreet, genuine, without the scars of the past. He met Lara in a bookstore, in one of those chance encounters that seemed to be guided by an invisible hand. She was different from anything he had known, light, sincere, without the games and masks that hurt him so much. Little by little, David allowed himself to believe again, not in a perfect love, but in a real love, where there would be no room for lies or half-truths. One night, as they walked hand in hand through a park lit by soft lanterns, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. A deep and lasting peace, one that comes not from the absence of problems, but from the certainty that, finally, he was where he was supposed to be. He smiled at Lara, who returned a shy smile, and, for the first time in a long time, David felt that the future, so uncertain and dark months ago, now offered him possibilities that he had not even dared to dream of. In contrast, Isabella, alone in her cold room, watched social media, seeing photos of parties, meetings, celebrations that she was now no longer part of. And it was through one of these photos that she saw David and Lara together for the first time. There was no ostentation, there was no revenge, just two sincere smiles, two looks that met with tenderness and respect. The blow was more painful than any other public humiliation he had suffered. Because there, stamped in that simple image, was the irrefutable confirmation that David had not only overcome her, but that he had found the happiness that she thought belonged to them forever. And in the silence of the morning, staring at that illuminated screen while silent tears ran down her face, Isabella finally understood, certain losses are eternal, certain choices have no return, and some betrayals don't just break the present, they forever destroy the bridges that connect to the future. The days that followed the impact of those photos were like a dense fog in Isabella's mind. The image of David and Lara smiling at each other never left his head, like a photograph engraved in his already punished memory. In the small rented room, among the boxes that she never bothered to unpack, she wondered how everything could have collapsed so completely, so irremediably. The self-pity, which had previously served as a refuge, began to give way to something more bitter and truer, the realization that he was responsible for every loss, every separation, every silence that now filled his unbearably long nights. But what gnawed at her even more was the silent, devastating recognition that David, this man she destroyed with her own hands, was now moving on to a future she could never follow. While Isabella was wallowing in regrets and bitter memories, David was experiencing a dilemma that was taking root in his mind like a weed. No matter how much I tried to move forward, there was a lingering shadow, a nagging feeling that something still needed to be resolved. The reunion with happiness, the possibility of starting over with Lara, were real, palpable, but deep inside him there was an unanswered question that tormented him on silent nights: to what extent did he have the right to be happy while someone who once meant everything was sinking so deeply into his own error? It wasn't about love, nor about longing, but about an almost cruel compassion, about a sense of internal justice that didn't leave him completely at peace. It was as if there was still an unpaid debt, a piece of history that needed a worthy ending, and not just cold abandonment. This restlessness grew in his chest, fueled by small details of everyday life. A news about someone known who had fallen into disgrace, an unanswered message coming from an old number, an involuntary memory of a laugh that was once his. Lara noticed the weight forming in David's eyes, but, wise and patient, she didn't press. I understood that certain wounds needed to be faced head-on so that they could finally heal. David knew he needed to confront this dilemma before it poisoned the new life he was trying to build. He needed to look into Isabella's eyes once again, not to restore what had been destroyed, but to seal, once and for all, the cycle that insisted on remaining open. Driven by this dark need for closure, David made a decision that many would consider unthinkable. He looked for Isabella. Not to save, not to rescue, but to deliver to her the hardest and most necessary truth, the truth about what she had become, not to others, but to herself. It was a cruel but inevitable mission. He arranged a simple, straightforward meeting in a public park where no one else could hear or interfere. I didn't want any more intermediaries, excuses or pretenses. He just wanted the rawness of the naked truth, in front of the person he once loved and who now needed to face himself. When Isabella arrived, she already looked like a shadow of her former self. The once vibrant gaze was now opaque, the once haughty posture was now hunched over, almost defeated. David watched her approach with a mix of sadness and resignation. There was a silent plea for mercy in her, an almost childish hope that, perhaps, he would still see her as before. But that hope was crushed the moment David began speaking. Without anger, without shouting, but with unshakable coldness, he described the ruin she had wreaked on his own life. He explained how betrayal had not only broken a heart, but had revealed the true fragility of his essence. He said that the loss of family, friends and reputation was not the result of revenge or external manipulation, but a natural and inevitable consequence of those who choose to destroy the trust of those who love them. Isabella tried to interrupt, tried to justify, but David raised his hand in a calm gesture that instantly silenced her. He wasn't there to hear excuses. I was there to make her understand, for the first time, that the path to redemption was not through being accepted again by anyone, but through accepting herself as she was now, someone who needed to rebuild not a relationship, but her own soul. There is no going back, he said with piercing serenity, what you have lost is not the love of others. It was respect for yourself. The words hung in the air between them, heavy as stones. When he finished, David just stood up, without offering comfort, without extending his hand. He left Isabella sitting on the park bench, alone, surrounded by the distant sound of children playing and the indifferent rustle of leaves in the wind. He crossed the lawn without looking back, feeling strangely light, as if he had finally completed a necessary ritual to exorcise the last ghosts of the past. There was no hatred in his chest, there was no resentment. Just the acceptance that some stories end painfully because they need to teach lessons that happiness could never teach. As David walked away, Isabella felt something inside her break irreversibly. It wasn't the pain of abandonment, it wasn't loneliness, it wasn't even shame. It was the crushing realization that there was no one else to blame. No pretext, no circumstance, no excuse. There, on that anonymous park bench, faced with David's silent departure, she understood that the responsibility for his ruin lay entirely with her. And that reconstruction, if it were still possible, would have to start from scratch, without guarantees, without shortcuts, without anyone to guide it. In the days that followed, Isabella was plunged into a deep crisis, where every past action was re-examined in the relentless light of truth. The betrayals, the lies, the small deviations of character that, accumulated, had corroded its foundations. There was no more hiding. Every memory, every wrong choice, came back like daggers, forcing her to face the person she really was, not the one she pretended to be to the world. In the midst of this painful process, a timid spark began to form, the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to rebuild something of value, even if it was just for herself. While Isabella faced her lonely journey, David and Lara continued to build their story in silence, with patience and mutual respect. There was no rush, there were no demands. Each step was taken with the awareness of someone who knows the pains of the past and does not wish to repeat them. Together, They rediscovered the pleasure of simple things, a walk under the sunset, a shared coffee on a cold afternoon, a complicit look that said more than any words. David knew that scars don't disappear completely, but he learned that they didn't have to define the future. Every smile from Lara was a small victory over the old pain, a silent proof that love, when true, does not require perfection, just presence and sincerity. And so, as one rebuilt his world from a painful ruin and the other was reborn into a new life of possibilities, time, relentless and fair, took its course. But there was still one last twist reserved for this story, one last choice to be made, which would definitively define the fate of all of them. The days following the last meeting between David and Isabella were filled with a strange stillness, as if they were both trapped in different bubbles, following parallel lines that would never cross again. David, with the serenity of someone who had finished a cycle, dedicated himself more intensely to his new projects and to his relationship with Lara, but there was a subtle weight still hanging over him, something that was neither guilt nor regret, but a kind of silent mourning for the story that was, for the part of him that died along with the past. He didn't talk about it, not to Lara, not to himself in his most intimate thoughts, but on certain nights, as he walked around his room alone, he felt that there was something yet to come to an end, a lesson that needed to be fully understood before he could finally free himself. Lara, with her delicate intuition, noticed the moments when he retreated into himself, and, instead of putting pressure on him, simply welcomed him with her calm presence, as if she understands that some battles need to be fought in the silence of her own soul. She was not a replacement, never treated as a patch for old wounds. It was a new story, written in his own words, but David knew that, to live it fully, he would need to resolve within himself the remnants of that past that insisted on haunting him in fragments of memory. Isabella, on the other hand, was experiencing a more painful and profound transformation. The pride, once so present in his posture, had now completely disappeared. Living in isolation, without the social masks that protected her, forced her to confront versions of herself that she previously preferred to ignore. I spent my nights between self-help books, frustrated attempts at meditation, letters that I never sent and that I tore up in fits of tears. She blamed herself, hated herself, but little by little, in the midst of the pain, she began to accept that the first step towards any redemption would be the humility of recognizing, without excuses or artifices, who she had become. It was during this dark period that Isabella made a gesture of courage that not even she knew she was capable of. He looked for a therapist, not to get rid of the guilt, but to understand where, exactly, he had started to lose himself. The sessions were painful, full of awkward silences and hard-to-face truths, but for the first time, she stopped looking for blame outside of herself. He understood that the betrayal, the deceit, the destruction of his own world, had not started when he met another man, but much earlier, in small daily choices, in the way he neglected his own truths and had unrealistic expectations about life and love. As Isabella immersed herself in her silent reconstruction, David received an unexpected invitation. An award ceremony for social projects in which he was nominated, thanks to the volunteer work he had undertaken in the months following the divorce. Alongside Lara, who encouraged his desire to return to the world part of the goodness he believed he had lost, David agreed to participate, without imagining that this event would bring a final and unexpected twist. The ceremony was elegant, in a glass hall under the stars, with a light and celebratory atmosphere. David, hand in hand with Lara, felt that this was recognition not only of the work done, but also of an internal transformation that few could understand in its entirety. It was in the middle of the event, while walking through the lit corridors, that David spotted Isabella in the distance. It was different, very different. Thinner, hair tied up in an unpretentious way, wearing simple clothes, no makeup, no attempt to impress or mask who she was. I was there as a volunteer, helping to organize the event, discreetly cleaning tables, arranging chairs, handing out pamphlets. When their eyes met, there was a moment of absolute silence, a mutual recognition of the unbridgeable distance that now existed between them. Isabella didn't try to get closer, she didn't try to start a conversation, she didn't make any gesture that betrayed regret or despair. He just nodded slightly, in a gesture of silent respect, before returning to his work. David, in turn, felt an unexpected peace. There was no anger, no pity, just the mature understanding that each was exactly where they were supposed to be. He at Lara's side, walking towards new beginnings, her, rebuilding herself from the ground she herself had chosen to walk on. The night continued peacefully, but full of hidden meanings. In a moment of rest, while having a coffee in a more private corner, David and Lara talked about unexpected encounters and the ironies of life. Lara, with her serene wisdom, just said that the past serves to teach, not to imprison. David, upon hearing this, felt for the first time that the page was finally turning effortlessly, without the need for pushing or forced denials. That morning, while driving home with Lara asleep in the seat next to him, David reflected on the complexity of forgiveness, not the one offered in words or public gestures, but the internal, silent one, which allows pain to be seen as part of the story itself, without poisoning what is yet to come. He understood that forgiving Isabella did not mean forgetting or minimizing what she did, but accepting that she was also human, fallible, and that, on some level, she was already paying the price for her mistakes in the harshest way possible, living the consequences of her own choices. At the same time, Isabella, finishing her volunteer shift, walked slowly home, with a strange feeling of relief and melancholy mixed together. For the first time in months, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a small spark of redemption possible, not through the approval of others, but through the chance to be someone better than I was before. She knew the road would be long, lonely, and without guarantees, but, strangely, that no longer scared her as much as it used to. When he finally arrived at his small rented room, he lay down on the cold bed and, instead of sinking into tears like so many other nights, he just allowed himself to be silent, listening to his own breathing. She was weak, she was fragile, but she was alive. And for the first time in a long time, he accepted that maybe this was enough to start again, one step at a time. The following week, life returned to its normal rhythm. David and Lara, now even more connected, began planning a small trip, an escape to the coast, where they could get lost on the deserted beaches and rediscover the simplicity of the present. Isabella, in turn, signed up for a night course, decided to go back to studying, not to impress or compete, but for herself, to rebuild something internal that no external approval could provide. And so, as the seasons changed again, taking with them the dead leaves of autumn and bringing the timid promise of renewal, they each went their own way. No perfect path, no path without pain, but true paths, walked with the painful and liberating awareness of those who faced their own abysses and chose to move forward, even if their feet still trembled with each step. Time, always impassive, continued its course, dragging away the last remnants of what once was and shaping new realities for those who survived the storm. David, now fully immersed in his new life, saw each dawn as a silent confirmation that he had made the right choice to move forward without carrying the ghosts of the past. His relationship with Lara blossomed organically, without rushing, like a tree that grows strong because its roots were planted in real soil. The scars he carried had not disappeared, but had turned into marks of wisdom, silent reminders of everything he had to face to finally find peace. Along with Lara, David discovered a type of love that was not made of illusory promises or suffocating expectations, but of mutual freedom, deep respect and small joys that, when added together, built serene and lasting happiness. Every smile shared, every comfortable silence between them, was a celebration of the arduous journey that had led him here. Isabella, in turn, walked a dry and lonely path that few have the courage to tread. Abandoned by the society that once applauded her, forgotten by the friends she herself alienated, she found herself forced to rebuild not only the public image she valued so much, but something much more difficult, her own soul. The volunteer work, the night classes, the endless therapy sessions, everything was a continuous effort to relearn what it meant to be someone worthy of respect, even if she herself often doubted her ability to redeem herself. The early mornings were still heavy, full of thoughts that hammered her conscience relentlessly, but, slowly, Isabella learned not to victimize herself. I accepted that pain was necessary, that shame was a part of the growth process, that each tear shed was a brick placed in the rebuilding of a shattered self. And so, with small, staggering steps, she continued, without guarantees, without applause, without easy promises. A year after that fateful meeting in the park, an unexpected event brought the three central characters of this story to the same space for the last time. A local art exhibition, organized to raise funds for social projects, where David, Lara and Isabella, through completely different paths, ended up meeting. Life, with its cruel sense of irony, seemed to want to close the cycle definitively. David and Lara walked hand in hand among the works on display, smiling discreetly, sharing comments and impressions like two lovers who had learned to respect each other's time and space. Isabella, now part of the event support team, wore simple, discreet clothes and moved with the silent confidence of someone who no longer sought looks of approval. When the three finally saw each other, there was a moment of heavy silence, like the last breath of a story about to be buried forever. David, with an almost imperceptible nod of the head, greeted Isabella. She returned it with a restrained smile, without the haughtiness she had before, without the paralyzing shame that had dominated her months ago, just with the calm acceptance of someone who knows that certain things cannot be changed, only understood. Lara, a keen observer, lightly squeezed David's hand, not jealous, not suspicious, just a subtle reminder that the past, however much it had shaped the present, no longer had power over them. That night, Isabella walked alone to the edge of the river that ran through the city. He sat on a wooden bench, hugging his knees, and looked at the dark, silent water. There were no tears, there were no lamentations. There was, finally, the full understanding that she could not erase the mistakes she made, but she could decide what to do from there. And, in that moment of absolute loneliness, she decided that she would not only be defined by her falls, but also by her ability to get up, to persist, to transform pain into learning. Isabella knew that she would never get back what she lost, that she would never again have the chance to rewrite her story with David, but she also knew that, deep down, surviving was already a form of victory. David and Lara, upon returning home that night, talked at length about reunions, about forgiveness, about how time turns even the ugliest scars into distant memories. David, looking at the starry sky as he drove, felt a deep gratitude for the opportunity to start over, for the chance to experience a love built not on the absence of defects, but on the full acceptance of them. Lara, with her light laugh and quiet wisdom, was the constant reminder that sometimes suffering is the necessary price for something truly good to blossom. David and Isabella's story didn't end with screams or big dramatic revelations. It ended with what really matters: acceptance of reality, growth through pain, the freedom found in the ability to move forward without carrying unnecessary burdens. And if there is a lesson to be learned from all of this, it is that betrayals, however devastating they may be, also carry the seeds of profound transformations. That choices, good or bad, shape the path we take. And that, in the end, we are the only ones responsible for what we have become. With this story, we want to remind everyone here that our channel does not, under any circumstances, support any type of betrayal. The stories we tell are fictions created to show how wrong choices can destroy lives, families and dreams. And most importantly, to reinforce that loyalty, respect and honesty are the true foundations of any healthy relationship. If you've made it this far, leave your opinion on this story in the comments. What did you think of the ending? Do you believe in second chances? We really want to know what you think. And of course, if you liked this story, subscribe to the channel to follow more intense narratives like this. Stories that stir emotions and make us reflect on life, choices, and the consequences of our actions. Thank you very much for being with us until the end. Until the next story.